Hello, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. I wanted to discuss today, do we have enough evidence to support Jesus' divinity? As St. Paul said in Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. One of the most well-attested and undisputed facts of Christianity is the fact the early Christian martyrs, such as Peter, Paul, and James, preached for decades that Jesus is risen, despite severe persecution and eventual martyrdom. They refused to recant, to spare their lives, and persevered, following Jesus' example. The intention of this video is to strengthen this point and to provide solid support for Jesus' resurrection. The vast majority of biblical scholars concur that the New Testament was written in the first century by multiple independent authors, and most books were written by St. Paul before the Romans destroyed the Jewish Second Temple in 70 A.D. Paul was beheaded by Nero between 64 and 67. Please note that when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., it took away the ability of the Savior to appear in the temple after that. You'll note in Malachi 3:1 that the prophet says that Jesus will be visiting the temple. 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul documented the 500 witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, was based on a creed Christians had memorized between 1 and 5 years after Jesus' resurrection in 33. Atheist and agnostic scholars such as Michael Shermer and Bart Ehrman have also acknowledged this dating. In other words, the New Testament was written during the lifetimes of many who either knew Jesus or knew people who knew Jesus and who were witnesses to his resurrection. In 66 A.D., the Roman historian, pagan, and skeptic of Christians named Tacitus documented early Christian persecution in his annals. He wrote of the way Nero shifted the blame of the Great Fire in 64 to the Christians as follows. Here's what he says. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of his procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Tacitus further stated, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle. In Tacitus's extra-biblical report, we learn 1, a group of people were labeled Christians. 2, this group was mocked and persecuted due to their beliefs in Christianity. 3, rather than recant their beliefs to save themselves from persecution, they pled guilty and were brutally tortured. 4, their leader was called Christus, which is the Roman word for Christ. And 5, Christ suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. They stood out from the pagans of the time, having chosen to honor Christ by living morally upright lifestyles. In Pliny's report to the Emperor Trajan, Pliny states that the Christians bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. In 126 A.D., the pagan Greek physician Galen observed that Christians practiced self-discipline and self-control in matters of food and drink, and their pursuit of justice a pitch not inferior to that of genuine philosophers. Why didn't these early Christian martyrs recant to avoid mocking and exquisite tortures? This group of people lived during the lifetimes of those who had witnessed Jesus' ministry and resurrection, and perhaps some among them had known and witnessed Jesus' resurrection. So rather than deny that truth, they chose to be martyred. In other words, they were not only believers who had chosen to die for their Savior, they were witnesses to our Savior's resurrection. In the same decade in which Tacitus wrote annals, Peter, James, Jesus' half-brother, and Paul were martyred, as documented by early church fathers and historians. They also chose not to recant. So we have Paul. Paul's beheading by Nero was documented by Origen, Tertullian, and Dionysius of Corinth. The martyrdom of James was documented by Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. Peter was crucified upside down, as confirmed by Eusebius, the first church historian, in his book Ecclesiastical History, and also by Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, and Origen. Interestingly, Peter, James, and Paul weren't always such ardent believers. In the Gospels, we learn that Peter denied Jesus 3 times just before Jesus was crucified. He and Jesus' other disciples went into hiding after his crucifixion. The apostles and Jesus' family members did not even bury Jesus. Instead, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, buried Jesus in his own tomb because he chose to go against the group who had demanded Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus' family also questioned his divinity during his ministry, as reported by Matthew and Luke, but after Jesus appeared to his half-brother James, James became an ardent follower and early church leader in Jerusalem. James was certainly in the position to denounce the claim that Jesus had not sinned, if Jesus had sinned, but James said nothing of the sort. James in James 1:2-5 writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that testing your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you." Paul was a very zealous early persecutor of Christians, known as Saul, who witnessed Christianity's first martyr, Stephen's stoning. Then Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and Paul became one of Christianity's greatest advocates. He was stoned, beaten, shipwrecked, and jailed, yet he never recanted. "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in difficulties," he said. "For when I am weak, then I am strong." He reported that in 1 Corinthians 12:10. Jews accused early Christians of turning the world upside down at that time. Nothing could stop them. According to Acts 5:27-30, the apostles were brought in and made to appear before the Sanhedrin to be questioned by the high priest. "We gave you strict orders not to teach in his name," he said. "Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teachings and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood." Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than human beings." When they heard this, they were furious and they wanted to put him to death. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin. "Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in a revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." Before Christianity was finally legalized in 313 by Constantine, the movement had grown to between 5 and 6 million people. With God, nothing is impossible. So I want to switch gears for just a moment here, and I want to go to a nice sermon that I heard a long time ago from a pastor called Stephen Rummage in a Baptist church in Florida. He said the story: "There was once a very wealthy old man who lived in a mansion which was adorned with all sorts of expensive items. Exquisite pictures and paintings lined the walls. Fine furniture filled the rooms, and fancy decorations were placed all about. The wealthy man had but one son, and the son joined the military. He died soon afterwards while serving in the war, which greatly saddened the old man. One day, a friend of the young man who died came to the house of the old man. He carried with him a portrait of the old man's son, which he had painted himself. He told the old man that he had served with the son in the war and that the son died while trying to save him. The portrait was his way to remember the love the son had shown for him. He gave the portrait to the old man, who thanked him. The quality of the portrait wasn't to the old man's usual standards, quite unlike the portraits he had purchased in the past, yet something about the picture was unique and precious. Something seemed real about the way the friend had portrayed his son's eyes. They were exactly as the old man had remembered. He hung the portrait in a very prominent place in the home. just above the mantel of a fireplace. A few years passed before the old man died. With no other family members to inherit his wealth, he had directed that an auction be held. The first item to be auctioned was the portrait of his son. People came from all around to the auction, anxiously anticipating the opportunity to purchase some valuable items. When the auctioneer held up the portrait, no one bid on it. He called out again, and a little old lady who worked as a maid in the old man's home bid on the portrait. She gave all she could afford, which was $50. Since no one else bid any higher, the portrait went to the lady. The auctioneer then announced that the auction was over. People were shocked, asking about all of the other items in the home and about the home itself. It's over, you see. The will said that everything goes to the person who purchases a picture of my son. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope you'll go to Christian-apologist.com. I hope you'll like and subscribe, and we'll talk again. Bye-bye.